Hey, salvete, discipuli et discipuli. What fun this is for me. Your teacher, Magistra Stewart, was actually a discipula of mine at the University of Georgia back in the 1990s, and she was a great student, as you can imagine. Very sweet, very smart, very hardworking. So you guys are so lucky to have her as your Latin teacher. And so she reached out to me a few days ago and wondered if I would put together a recording reading some lines from Virgil's Aeneid. And I said, I'm happy to do it. And my wife is the camera person, so I put her to work. Um, you know, you may have heard it said that one of the greatest fears that people have is the fear of public speaking. I'm sure none of you have that kind of stage fright. But I think an even greater fear for a lot of people is the fear of speaking in public in a foreign language, in a language other than your native language. It can be scary. Not so much with Latin because Latin pronunciation is so easy and straightforward. And you guys have been in Latin. I think you're in AP Latin now. And by the way, while I'm thinking of it, I think the AP exam is coming up pretty soon, right? So let me give you a good accusative of exclamation, bonam fortunam. Bonam fortunam. Good luck on that uh, exam. But you've been taking Latin now for, I guess, what, at least a couple of years, 3 or 4 years, and you know that indeed pronunciatio Latina est facilis. Pronunciatio Latina est facilis. Latin pronunciation is easy. And when it comes to reading poetry aloud, I'm going to say it's really almost just like reading prose. It's really just, it shouldn't be any more difficult for you, especially at this point with a few years of Latin under your belt. It shouldn't be any more difficult than reading English aloud, reading an English poem or a short story. I'm going to share with you an anecdote. So there was this professor at the University of Texas, the late, great Professor Gareth Morgan, and he told us a little story about a student who came to his office one day. It was a student who was in his Vergil class, college student, and the student sat down and said, Professor, I think I'm beginning to get the hang of this Latin poetry stuff, the translation and all of that. But can you tell me, this is what I'm having trouble with, how do you put the meter in? Well, Professor Morgan, who was a pretty dramatic guy himself, said, What? What do you mean put the meter in? Listen, the poet Virgil put the meter in, and your task is simply to bring it back out again, to bring the sound effects, the rhythms, the meter back to life again. And that, by the way, is the meaning of the word recite. To recite a poem, it comes from the Latin verb recito, recitare, which means to bring something back to life again. It's like to excite or to incite a riot. We don't want to incite a riot, but to recite means to bring something back to life again. You know that prefix, re. And how do you do it? Well, there are only two things to keep in mind, and it's the same with Latin as it is in English. How do you read a text aloud, especially a dramatic text, a poem? First, read the words correctly, and secondly, with attention to what they mean. So you can read Latin correctly, pronunciation is easy. You know the vowels, the consonants, all of that. You've learned, where the accents go. Latin pronunciation is so easy. So read the words correctly, that's all, and with attention to meaning. And so all that means is that if you're reading a poem aloud, you want to read expressively. One of my favorite American poets was Edgar Allan Poe. One of my favorite poems of his was The Raven. And the last thing you want to do if you're reciting the Raven aloud is something like, once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary. How boring. Yeah, and wearisome, in fact. But, you want to read any text that's worth reading aloud. You want to read it expressively, even dramatically. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. Well, we're not here to read Edgar Allan Poe, but in any case, you get my meaning. So it's the same thing with reading Latin aloud, and I've got in front of me here the text of the first 11 lines of the Aeneid, and if you've got your textbooks there, I hope so. Just go ahead and open to Book 1, those opening lines, and I'm going to give you a couple of pointers here, and I'm sure Magistra Stewart has already pointed some of these things out. But certainly you don't want a sing-song, monotonous kind of reading. We sure don't want arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus ab oris. You want to pause in the appropriate places, like at the end of a phrase or the end of a sentence, wherever you might see a punctuation mark. So arma virumque cano. You have a little pause there. In fact, you might know that's called a caesura. And then there are other places where you don't want to pause. For example, looking here, you've got your text, right? Looking at the second line, notice that in the middle of the line, a new clause begins with Lavinia, and that clause, and Lavinia, of course, is an adjective that modifies the noun litora, and so you don't want to have an unnatural pause at the end of that verse, because Lavinia que venit litora, that's a clause, right, with a subject and a modifier and a verb. So you want to pause in the appropriate places dramatically. But if there's a line that if there's a sentence that starts on one line and carries over to the beginning of the next, then obviously you don't want to pause there. So that's one issue. And of course, reading expressively, dramatically, you're looking, just as you would in English, for key words where you want to express the right emotionality. And as I look down at this text, some of the words that jump out at me in line 4, for example, is Siwai. So we're talking about Juno here, the queen of the gods, who has, no affection for Aeneas nor for the Trojans. She, of course, was a supporter of the Greeks in the Trojan War. So she is savage, she's angry, so we've got Iram, and so on. So when you see, you want to read the text silently to yourselves at first, and get a good sense of what's going on, and then give the appropriate emphasis to the key words. Oh, and there's that word anger again at the end of verse 11. I'm going to read these first 11 lines for you. Does such anger exist in the gods, is that closing line. So here, I'm going to give this a shot. I'll give it my best shot. I always say I'm glad that Vergil isn't here to critique me, because I won't read this perfectly, and nobody expects you to read it perfectly. You just want to remember those 2 rules. Try to read the lines, the words correctly, and with attention to meaning, and understand that Vergil read Latin one way. Cicero read it a little differently. Cicero's wife differently still, and his children. So there are individual differences. And I'm gonna just give this my best shot, and I'll bet some of you can do an even better job. So just follow along with me in your textbooks if you wish. Arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus aboris Italiam, fato profugus, lavinia quae venet litera, multum letteris jactatus et alto, vi super Rome saevae memorem unones ob iram. Multa quoquet bello passus, dum conderet urbem, inferretque Deos latio, genus unde Latinum, Albanique patres, atque altae moenia Romae. Musa, mihi calsas memora, quo numene laeso, quidve dolens, regina Deum tot volvere casus, insignem pietate virum, tot adire labores impuleret. Tantae nanimis caelestibus irae. So anyhow, there's my attempt, and I'll expect that Magistra Stewart could do just as fine a job. It's a lot of fun. I've loved poetry myself since I was a kid. I started Latin when I was about 11 years old. Never stopped. I'm 75 now, so I've been doing the language for 64 years. I still got a lot to learn. But the main thing with studying Latin, as with any subject, is to put your heart into it, do what you need to do to learn a lot and to enjoy yourselves. So good luck again on the AP exam coming up later this week, and so for now I'll just say, Valete omnes discipuli et discipuli. Valete.